Hot air balloons are pure magic. There's no other way to explain being lifted to the sky by a giant balloon and basket. What's even more fascinating is how their technology has been revolutionized to make them safer by modern standards. That too, without affecting their characteristic magic. But have you ever wondered how exactly hot air balloons work? You might know the basics, but not the details that we're about to share in today's video. Let's start with hot air balloons, the beginning. You'd assume there's not a lot of science behind how exactly a hot air balloon might work. After all, Hollywood would have you believe that hot air balloons are as simple as turning a stove on and dropping some weighted sacks to the ground. But you'd be surprised to find that the reality is a bit more complex than that simplified depiction. Did you know that hot air balloons are where air travel really began? Of course, there's the traditional story of the Wright brothers dreaming up an airplane, but before all that, there were two other brothers, Joseph Michael and Jacques-Antoine Montgolfier. This duo developed the first practical means of human flight, the hot air balloon. This was almost 120 years before the Wright brothers came up with the engine-powered human flight method. We live in a world where human flight is far more common than it once was. Any person can operate an air vehicle with just a few months of training, in fact. And in a world like this, where everything seems so industrialized, it's natural to seek more mechanical routes. So, what's the theory behind hot air balloons? Next, we have the theory behind hot air balloons. In a single word, buoyancy. Now, basic high school physics would tell you that buoyancy is the tendency of an object to float or rise when submerged in a fluid. What that means is that hot air balloons rely on the upward force created by the air around them to steadily rise. It's the same mechanism that makes boats function. In essence, boats are able to float on water because their weight, which is pulling them downwards, is nearly perfectly counterbalanced by the upward force created by the pressure of the water underneath. So, as you may know, boats do partially sink in the water depending on how heavy they may be. This also works when they're bigger in size because then they're pushing down on a larger area of water beneath them, and as such, the force of the water pushing them upwards is counterbalanced. If that sounds complicated, there's another way to look at it. Usually, things float if they're less dense or lighter than water, and sink if they're heavier. A hot air balloon functions similar to that. Now for hot air balloons and buoyancy. Now that we know what buoyancy means, let's talk about how it relates to hot air balloons. You may have noticed that a hot air balloon is always open at the bottom, unlike a traditional balloon, which is often tied to keep the air in. This means that the density inside the hot air balloon specifically can be altered, while the pressure inside it can remain the same as the pressure outside it. And below the balloon, there's almost always a burner of some kind. While this burner doesn't really act as a pump, it does heat up the air inside the balloon, which makes it less dense. As the burner heats up the air inside it, the molecules move further away from each other. This expands the air, and some of it escapes out the balloon, which is now made less dense. And as we've learned so far, less dense matter floats or rises when surrounded by a matter of higher density. This is also why smoke rises, by the way, because smoke is hotter than the air surrounding it. And like tiny ships aren't very useful when it comes to carrying large cargo, you'd need a bigger balloon to be able to lift a bigger weight. That's partly why the balloons are so big above those average-sized baskets. Just to lift an adult man, you'd need a balloon that's about 4 meters in radius, so you can create more lift using a larger volume of hot gas. So, how does a hot air balloon work in practice? Okay, enough talk about physics and theory. Let's talk about how hot air balloons actually work in practice. The logistics of the hot air balloon go beyond the physics of just knowing that hot air rises. If you know the basic science behind the balloon, could you build it yourself? Well, very possibly, with a lot of trial and error. To start out building an actual physical hot air balloon, you need 3 things: an envelope, a burner, and a basket. So, what's an envelope? This is what we usually know as the balloon. The gigantic, often colorful balloon is known by professionals in the field as an envelope. Seeing any picture of an envelope around people can help you realize just how enormous these bad boys can be. Today, the envelopes are generally made of a strong, light, durable synthetic fiber, usually ripstop nylon, which is a nylon that's sewn together in squares to prevent tears from spreading. Another thing you might have noticed in the pictures are the curved vertical strips sewn very tightly together. These sections are known as gores, and they're sewn tightly to create a strong, airtight container that won't leak. Did you know that there's also a hole at the top of the envelope alongside the bottom? At the crown, a parachute vent or a parachute valve is located that can be opened by pulling on a cord. This valve lets hot air escape and helps the balloon come back down. The bigger opening at the bottom of the balloon is known as the throat, and it's reinforced with a fireproof skirt. The skirt is made of fireproof material like Nomex to stop it from melting or burning during flight. And now, what's a burner? A burner is fairly self-explanatory. The hot air that eventually gives the balloon its flight is fueled by propane cylinders, kind of like the ones people use for camping. The number of gas jets in a balloon can vary from anywhere from 1 to more, and these extra burners help provide more lift or act as a fail-safe in case the primary burner stops working. Each of these cylinders provides about 70 to 90 liters of fuel and can weigh anywhere between 110 and 140 pounds when full. Next, we have the basket. The basket is what carries the passengers into the sunset. basket. It's traditionally a wicker basket that's suspended underneath both the burners and the envelope. Why wicker though? After all, we can probably use a more industrial material. But wicker is light, durable, and very important, squashy. The squishiness of the basket helps it absorb some of the impact shock in the case of the balloon landing too quickly. Conventionally, 8 ropes of chains were used to connect the basket to the burners, which then led to the balloons with the help of a very strong load-bearing tape. This tape ran across the length of the balloon from the throat to its crown. So how do you fly a hot air balloon? Now that you understand the theory behind hot air balloons and how to assemble one, let's talk about flight. How does one fly and operate a hot air balloon? Let's take you through the process step by step. First things first, you unwrap the envelope and lay it down on the ground in preparation for the launch. Then you tie it very securely to both your propane burners and your basket. After that, you'll use a cold air fan to initially fill the envelope with air and inflate it enough to operate your burners. After removing the fan after inflation, you'd use the burners to heat the air inside the balloon until you start to lift off the ground in your basket. Now that you're airborne, there's nothing much to do other than controlling the balloon's ascent and descent. Lastly, we have steering a hot air balloon. To go up, you would naturally turn on the burners to heat the air inside the envelope, and you'd open the parachute valve to retreat back down. This will help cool air enter the balloon and the hot air escape. Okay, but what about steering? Well, that comes when you're experienced enough in the art of ballooning. You can control the steering of the balloon to some extent by the up and down motions. You'd make the balloon rise and fall according to the air currents, like winds or breezes, to very roughly move the balloon in a preferred direction. The best or worst part, depending on how much you crave control about hot air ballooning, is that you can never be 100% sure of where you might end up. You can just stand back, enjoy the view, and wait for fate, or particularly strong air currents to decide your landing destination. And that's all for this video. What are your thoughts on hot air ballooning? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed watching the video, be sure to leave a like and share the video. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications by pressing the bell icon to get notified every time we post a new video. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.